So, Katie, where are you coming in from today?
I'm coming in from London, so I'm about 30 miles north of London, truly, and the sun is just coming up here. So hopefully it's going to get lighter as we go on.
We'll see the London sunrise. I hope so. That'd be
It's
wonderful.
indeed.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast, Katie. Your career is really fascinating to me because I know you've worked in as a chief product officer and really developing a lot of amazing products, and you began your career as an analyst too. But where you've got to in the project management space, almost like a project management whisperer, is not the road I would have expected in a way. So sometimes it happens the other way around, I think, where people start in project management and then they sort of leads to product owner, product sponsor type roles. So what are the milestones or the hallmarks in your career, in your life, that have led you to being in this space today, and particularly writing your fabulous book?
Well, thank you so much, and thanks again for having me. I think it was an interesting winding road. I like to joke that it was less purposeful than just following what seemed to unfold and come next. So, as you said, I started my career as an analyst. I then went back and got a graduate degree, and I spent many years as an economist as well. Again, very analytical. And when I was an economist, it was drilled into me by some fantastic mentors that I worked with. What is the evidence telling you? What are the numbers telling you? Where's the story? How do we take this information and turn it into something useful? And I did a lot of writing for our clients at that time, explaining, very often dry concepts and trying to make them useful for our audience. And then I got more involved just off the side of my desk at first in product management, which I know we share a background. You have a background in product as well, some experience as a
Yes.
product owner, I believe. And I found that fascinating because I see product as really sitting at the intersection of a lot of stakeholders across the business. And I think the analytical background made it easier for me to step into that, because one of the most difficult things about managing those stakeholders is they have competing priorities. And when you have competing
Yes.
priorities, how do you decide where to focus your resources? And so I took a very analytical, evidence-based approach to that, given my background, which seemed to work well. I was able to talk with these stakeholders about why we might be pursuing not what they wanted us to pursue, and with evidence to back it up. And then as I grew in my career, I went from being a product manager working on one set of priorities for my product to being a chief product officer where I was working on hundreds of priorities across rather large product stacks. And that's where the project management comes in, because then you're not just, and this is where I think, particularly Agile and software development methodologies become so prevalent that now everything is Agile. Like,
Yes.
my target audience that I've worked with through most of my career is procurement and supply chain. And I had to giggle when Agile procurement became a thing.
Right.
Agile
Yes.
everything, right? And one of the key things that I discovered as I moved from being a product manager to being a chief product officer is that Agile works really well within a contained set of priorities. Where most organizations struggle is in Agile, like how the different Agile teams work together, and how do the priorities of the business sit. And that's where project management comes in, because the project managers are trying to get lots of Agile teams for the work that they do to knit together. And that was, to me, the difference in being a product manager to being a chief product officer is all of a sudden you're not just making the strategic decisions about what your individual product stack needs to do. You're making decisions about how to spread resources across a number of teams, and that's a really different thing. If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
So it's going from that vertical or functional responsibility or accountability to more of a lateral accountability. And I love some of the ways you frame this, because you talk about chunky corporates. We're going to get into that in a minute, but particularly in chunky corporates, you see that the complexity across those vertical functionalities, and there has to be some way of connecting those priorities across a number of different areas. And I know you've had a lot of experience in transformation too, because that's where often you see that complexity even amplified, I think, when you've got large transformation going on, digital transformation, or any other type of transformation going on in an organization. Katie, can you tell me a little bit about, maybe give me an idea of a big, audacious transformation where you sort of cut your teeth and thought, this is crazy, I've got to write a book?
um, there were a few, and and the book is informed across a number of roles. And it's really funny because the organizations I've worked at and the organizations I've worked with, every single one of them, I've had a colleague or a former colleague read the book and go, "Oh, you clearly wrote this about our organization." And I'm like, "No, I didn't." but what that I love that, because what it says to me is these are so common. Like, these stories are so common that they could have been anywhere. But the most audacious transformation that I worked on, that kind of was the beginning of the book, and where I started to write what began as essays about what I learned,
Mm-mm.
was a replatforming exercise. So I like to separate software new build from replatforming. And what replatforming means just is kind of what it says on the tin. If you break the words down, is you have software platform or an ecosystem of software applications, and they already exist. They're already in use by your customers, and they need to be rebuilt. Either a portion or all of them need to be rebuilt. And I think we're in a very particular time right now, because if you look at modern applications and applications that were built quite recently, they were built in such a way that you can swap out little parts. They were kind of future proof. But
Yes,
most chunky corporates, as we refer to them, don't have that kind of software. They've been around long enough where their software was built before that was the way of building software.
exactly.
Their platforms are all knitted together, and so they don't have the luxury of going, "Oh, we're just going to swap out this bit or swap out that bit." So they end up in these big projects to re-platform, and they kind of they're typically forced to rebuild the whole thing. And so I worked on one at an organization where, through that organization's global growth and international growth, it had ended up with 27 different software platforms that all did kind of the same thing, but in different ways, and 27 different databases with global supply chain data that we wanted to bring together. And that was a huge transformation. And we were not only transforming the software, but also transforming the business in some critical ways. We were transforming the business from being software focused to being data focused. And we were transforming the business from being custom software to productized software. And I love to tell the story. I was working with a group of startups, and I kind of started working with this metaphor that seemed to play well, of buying a cake. The difference between custom software products and productized software. If you go into a boutique, and I had a young daughter at the time, I still have a young daughter, and we were buying her birthday cake, and we went into the fancy cake shop, and we went in and we said, "I want a chocolate cake with vanilla frosting, and I want a unicorn horn on the top, and I want all this, and I want it like this, and I want it like that." And it cost us a fortune. When they told us what this cake was going to cost, I thought, my goodness, she's not getting married, for heaven's sake. It was wildly expensive, but they were going to make it exactly how I wanted it. So we went, "Oh, no, she's 2. I'm not spending a fortune on a birthday cake. She won't even remember it." So we went into to our Sainsbury's, and it was like, "You want a chocolate cake or you want a vanilla cake?" You had no choice, but it was a heck of a lot cheaper. And to me, that's the difference. Like, you don't get it exactly how you want it. That's a product off the shelf. But the margins on
Yes,
those cakes are a lot higher than the margin on the beautifully, rightfully expensive cake. And software is just the same. So we were transforming the business from, "What do you want your software to do, Mr. Customer?" to, "This is how the software works. This is how much it costs. Take it or leave it." And so the change in that, every person in the organization had to understand that change to sell software, the
exactly.
new software. And that ended up being, we underestimated the impact of that change on the colleagues across the business.
And I think that's a very common mistake, is to underestimate the impact of the change. I've worked on large transformations from a change perspective, and even changing the way in which we talk about a process is required when you go through that kind of a change. So you're thinking about the sort of infrastructure and the software platforms changing, which, and at the same time you're changing process. but you're also changing the way every individual is going to interact with that process. And from an internal perspective, let alone from an external perspective, which adds another layer as well. And so
Mm.
there are so many interconnections. And this is where the underestimation comes from, because until we start to go into the dependencies, we don't really understand the impact of that change and how widely spread it will be, because there are ripple effects that aren't
Mm-hmm.
evident until you get started. So,
Yeah.
yes, and so Katie, tell me a little bit about the book. So the Lean Agile Dilemma, product management inside a chunky corporate. So tell me, what was the impetus to write a book? Because you're a busy person, you're a mum, and then you write a book as well. Just add add to your burden, because as an author, I know how hard that is. It's not an easy endeavor. It's always a passion project. So tell me, what was the passion, or perhaps what happened at the time that you were writing a book?
Well, it started as a bit of catharsis. I mentioned this project I've been working on, and I was really reflecting. I had a little bit of time in between roles, and as I said, I started writing essays because I really, again, that analytical background, that kind of economist hat, I really wanted to understand, like, gosh, we have all these books, the Lean Startup, of course, being the seminal one about product management. And what I experienced just didn't really align to what I had been taught in all these books. So I really wanted to understand why that is. What's the difference? Why is this not working? And what I discovered as I dug into it, and it goes back to a critical point that you just mentioned, which is relationships and interconnectedness. And it was funny because as I was writing some of these essays, really just for myself, my husband was also in the process. He had started a company and he had sold his startup. So he was in the transition from lean startup to chunky corporate in his life as well. And I was watching and I was talking to him about some of the stuff I was writing, and I was discovering he was experiencing all of this difference, like from one day to the next, he had gone from one to the other. And so I really started to think critically about, okay, well, what's different? What changes from that moment? And I've worked, as I said, with a number of startups as well. So what's truly different? And I landed on a few different things, which in retrospect feel quite obvious, but nonetheless, I think have implications that maybe I hadn't appreciated. One is that, a lean startup has freedom. It doesn't have oversight of a board or process
Mm-hmm.
that you see in large organizations. And it, with that freedom, it has the ability to apply lean agile principles, right? There's not monthly reporting on financials to an external board. There's not a lot of oversight. There's not a lot of process embedded. There's not a lot of relationships to manage. So, most startups, they start with 1, 2, maybe 3 people, and that's a few relationships to manage. Everybody knows their space, everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing, and everybody wears a lot of hats. As an organization scales, the relationships maybe there's 10 people, and everybody, there's a few more relationships to manage. But that's dramatically different from
Yes.
you go up the maturity curve of a business as a business scales, and then all of a sudden you have 500 people, 600 people. That's thousands of interpersonal relationships
Yes.
to manage. And so that's where the process comes in. You can't possibly manage thousands of interpersonal relationships the same way you manage 10 interpersonal relationships. So you put in processes to help people, and you've got more turnover. You've got more people coming into the organization. So how do you train them? You don't want to reinvent the wheel every time you train them. So again, silos, processes, those are all rightly in place in what I call chunky corporates in order to drive efficiency at a large organization. But they are in conflict with lean agile principles. The thing that a lean startup doesn't have that a chunky corporate does is access to capital. So, chunky corporates have lots of resources. They have deep pockets, lots of people. And it just fundamentally means that we need to adapt the way that we think about these things. The shift as companies come up that maturity curve goes from innovation. Lean startups are trying to find product market fit, and therefore they're iterating new software.
Yes.
And changing very quickly and focused on innovation. Fail, but fail fast. Chunky corporates have products. They have regular revenue generation and existing software. So their focus is on execution of the financial plan not innovation in the software. And that means that lean agile is just not really designed for them. So we need to adapt it. So the book came out of the reflection on that, which kind of in retrospect feels somewhat obvious. But at the time, and even since working with product teams, that's not obvious. Product teams
Not
are trying
obvious.
to apply lean agile in large organizations, and that's where a lot of it's falling over in the project
Exactly.
space.
Yeah, and I myself, I mean, I come from a Telstra. Before I was a consultant, I was a general manager at Telstra, leading change enablement across Telstra operations, 14,000 people. It's, it's really the Titanic when you're trying to shift that amount of people, and there's an iceberg in the way, but you're still shifting at sort of micro millimeters, and we were implementing agile at scale, and so there was an enormous pain around that. And that's why I loved your book, Katie, too, and I love speaking to you, because you talk about, don't try to be like, because they're like the startups. Because when we were very immersed in agile, when I was involved in that organization, and for those of you that don't know, Telstra is one of the largest telecommunications country in Australia, but they're in 15 different countries around the world, so it's multinational. And there was this absolute divinity when we spoke about startup culture and agile culture and startup. It was this, it was almost like the North Star for us. And what you talk about is there's a myth around that sexy startup. It's not necessarily fit for purpose when you have a chunky corporation. But I think in the chunky corporation, we're all trying to be agile, adaptable, and we're seeing the success of the startup community. We're seeing the success of these nimble organizations. And as leaders in that larger organization, we want some of that. And so there's this almost it's an erroneous belief that we can just simply lift and shift with some tweaks and it'll work. But Katie, you say no.
I do. Yes, I do. I mean, having worked with a number of startups, and having been being married to a founder, I recognize that not everybody is geared up or wants or has the right skill set to be a founder or a
Yeah,
startup. And let's not forget, most startups fail.
they do.
If you're if so, most successful startups, and many of the ones that fail as well,
Hmm.
are led by people who are incredibly dynamic and have amazing range of skill sets, or who are also in the right place at the right time, have the right access to capital, have a lot of luck. So there's a lot of things that go into a startup being successful. But one of the key things is the dynamic nature of the people that work in startups. And what I've observed working with startups is that there's a lot of turnover in the early days as those companies scale, because they can't afford to bring in colleagues who are unable to be dynamic and be unable to play lots of roles in the
Right.
organization.
Yes. Yes.
Most people in their working life have defined skill sets and are very good at what they do, but what they do has boundaries. And to me, that's one of the big differences. If you look at the general profile, and I am generalizing, and I, admittedly am generalizing, this isn't going to
Yeah.
be true for everyone, but a lot of people in larger organizations are quite comfortable with those boundaries. People go to work at large organizations and are attracted to large organizations typically because they're less risk tolerant than entrepreneurs, right? They want the stability, they want the security, they're comfortable with having a swim lane and working really well and performing well within that swim lane. And so when chunky corporates try to become lean startups, they're asking a team of people who have been attracted to that organization, have been hired to work in a swim lane, to work in a way that is outside their comfort zone and often their skill set. So I think chunky corporates should embrace the stability. Like, that is something lean startups cannot offer, that security. And that is what most people want in their working life. And most people perform very well in those environments and very predictably. And so I think what happens in a lot of organizations when business leaders and board members and investors start to hammer we should be more lean, we should be more agile, that doesn't actually work for the people who are employed in the organization. That's
Mhm.
not what they were hired for, and often they're not dynamic enough to stretch into that, or they don't know what it means, or if they want
Yes.
to, it doesn't work in the organization. So there's just a lot of complicating factors.
I think what you said is really insightful. They don't really know what it means, because I think that we often anywhere in any context will say things and we think we mean the same thing because it's the same word, but it's a completely different meaning. Just so we can clarify that, because I think that there are principles around agile and lean that are attractive to larger organizations, but really applying lean agile is a set of principles and sort of execution steps. Katie, can you differentiate, between, I guess, some of those principles that are attractive and what startups are really doing in terms of the execution of those principles that large organizations shouldn't really adopt?
Yeah, that's a great question. The key one is innovation versus execution. So when I was a product manager and I read the Lean Startup, I was like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant. And it is, I'm not taking anything away from how brilliant Lean Agile principles are at all. But what I found is I was applying those principles and putting forward business cases to my senior leadership team. And I never got a response. I never got, my first product was incredibly successful, but we didn't need a business case. We just went with it.
Oh,
and
right.
and then I got lucky probably. But then we were acquired by a much bigger organization, and that organization wanted to see a business case before we could do any software development. And most large organizations work like that, right? So I had to start writing business cases. But as an economist, I was very good at writing business cases. I can make up numbers to just about any tune. But they never got approved, and I never heard back. And I started to get really frustrated. It's about mid-career as a product manager, thinking I felt like that was a really good business case. Why didn't it work? And what I discovered as I got into the decision-making room, as I kind of scaled that ladder and kept going up, in the room, it was the risk aversion of the leadership team. They're not going to invest in a risky software build where the market is unproven, especially when they've got 27 different fires in existing software platforms that are broken, falling over, out of date, obsolete, need rebuilding, where they know they've got a customer base. If a large organization is going to go into an unproven market, it is in their financial interest to acquire a company that's already proven that market rather than to build organically. But nobody told me that when I was a product manager. And so it wasn't until I got onto the other side of that decision-making door that the penny dropped, and I thought, okay, now I get it. And that's the fundamental difference. They don't want innovation. Innovation is margin diluting for chunky corporates. They want execution. And so business cases should be focused on how do we execute within our client base. And there might be adjacent expansion of software within that client base, but how you monetize new features is a much more critical element in a chunky corporate than it is in a startup. What Lean Agile does very well is around efficiency of resources, around iteration and customer adoption. So we don't want to lose those things. I am certainly not suggesting that we go back to waterfall software development by any stretch of the imagination. But I think, understanding how to apply Agile and understanding that Lean isn't really built for chunky corporates. And, you might have teams within a large organization that are innovation focused. But in my experience, as soon as the cost conversation starts to happen, those are the teams that get cut.
Absolutely.
The first thing to go.
Experience as well. The experiment dies.
And because it's margin diluting, right? It's unproven. So I think, focusing on adapting Agile and really focusing where I see Agile failing in a lot of organizations is at the scale level. So the individual Scrum teams are performing very well, and they're delivering, on their metrics, burn down rates and story points, and they're doing all this stuff. But where it's failing is how it knits together. And that's where the scale comes in. Agile works very well for small teams, but not documenting your software and then expecting it to fit in to be a very small piece in a 1,000-piece jigsaw. That's where this falls over. So we need to keep Agile within the small teams, but focus more on how they work together. What's the cross-team management? And the elements that are common across those teams. So you may have 100 Scrum teams at large organizations all working together, and they share a common infrastructure and they work on common data. So they have to coordinate in some fashion. So to me, chunky corporates should really focus on how those teams work together, because when leaders just say Lean Agile, you get purists down in the ranks who are whispering, they don't know what that means, because that's not
Yeah.
really what they're asking us to do. They're asking us just to execute. They're asking us to work together. They're asking us to document everything. They're asking us to follow process. And so that's where the disconnect happens. And then those people in the front lines who are whispering, they don't know what it means, that creates an us versus them. And then you start to get dissonance across the organization.
What's your recommendation for the best way to knit across teams? So, to me, that's a collaboration dilemma. And I do a lot of practice around that. A lot of my consulting work is doing that. But I'd be really curious about your approach to that. What are some of the ways you'd advise, say, a CEO is having this problem of knitting priorities and resources across the delivery teams?
That's a great question. And I will say it's going to be a little bit different in every organization. But what I do in the book, I lay out a methodology for a very specific challenge, the replatforming challenge. And so I should say, I'm not suggesting that this methodology is appropriate for all software development.
Yes.
But so many chunky corporates are replatforming that I think it's worth laying out the difference and what can work in a replatforming exercise versus building new software. And there are a few fundamental things. The first is that alignment piece. To your point, if business leaders are saying we want you to be lean agile, and people down in the ranks are saying that I can't replatform under lean agile principles,
yes,
that creates a disconnect at the outset and misalignment at the outset of the project. So step number one is align and understand if you are replatforming, lean agile is not the right software development methodology for you. And so say that, be open. And I had this lovely conversation with a wonderful product owner and agile coach who was an absolute agile purist. And I said to him, this company is not asking you to innovate. So put that to one side. And he had a penny drop moment, kind of thinking, wait a minute, what are you talking about? But once we got over that hurdle, we were able to find a common language. And so step one is clearing that hurdle and aligning it all the way up and down and across the organization, both horizontally and vertically, around that principle. What are you actually trying to achieve? And is it innovation or is it execution? Step two is if you're replatforming, you already have a set of features. You know what you're trying to build.
Yes.
That lean was written for defining what your features are.
Yeah.
But you have a list, you have a minimum viable product, and it's huge. It's whatever is already in place in your organization, and your customers are not going to switch from their existing software to your new software until it has feature parity with what they're already using. So the minimum viable product is a different thing. It's much bigger than it would be in a lean startup. So step two is figuring out what is your minimum viable product and how are you going to roll it out and how are you going to get customers using it? How do you prevent it becoming a waterfall project? Because that's what so often happens. When you lay out all the features you have to build before your customers will adopt it, all of a sudden you're inadvertently you're having agile teams delivering a waterfall project. Yes. And that's where you get this misalignment. And so I lay out some key principles for how to avoid that, like how to walk that balance beam and how to get customers using it in a friendly way. Stay focused on delivering working software, but recognize your customers aren't going to adopt it in the same way they would a new software. And then the other one is focus on data. So data is noticeably absent from Lean Agile principles. And it makes sense because Lean Agile is written for new software, which is not usually dependent on data. Usually you generate data once the software is in use. When you are replatforming, you often have masses and masses of existing data, and they are your value add that provide a product moat to prevent other competitors stepping into your space. So that there's huge value in that data. You cannot throw it out. But in so many of the projects I've worked on, when project managers and engineers, when the technology team, and often product and tech working together, when they lay out the project plan, in 9 times out of 10 on the projects I've worked on, they're going to build the software and then they're going to bring the data into it. And inevitably, in every single one of those projects, there are hiccups. And some of those hiccups are relatively minor. The data don't, fit, or the dates don't align, and we've got dates in the U.S. format coming from here and dates in the U.K. format coming from there, and now all of our dates are out of whack. Those are little problems. I've also worked on projects where you hit big problems. So I worked on one replatforming exercise where only 5% of the customer data landed in the right place in the new software. And we were meant to go live the next week. Yeah. And we didn't, needless to
That
say.
face is the only thing I can do in response.
I know. That's the face of someone who knows how painful that is. Six months. 6 months it took to get that right. And it was based on the assumption by software engineers, oh, the data, that's an afterthought. We'll get it in. But the data, and interestingly, we had a data science team working in parallel, and they had been working for 18 months to try to align the data.
Yes.
But there was not communication across the two.
Yeah.
There were these assumptions of people working in silos, like, oh, it'll work. And I know that sounds like, oh, surely that's an anomaly. That never happens. I worked on another project. The next project I went and worked on, the first thing I said was, get the data right first. Get the data right first. Yeah, we're doing that. And then we got a month from go live, and I got called into a room. The data don't fit. We've got a fundamental mismatch in the data model. We're trying to pull data in, and it doesn't work. And I thought, we even had this conversation. But it's so counterintuitive to the way engineers are trained to think, because it's not even mentioned in their training. So they just assume it's an afterthought. So if you are a chunky corporate replatforming, for heaven's sake, get the data right first and then build software around it.
There is maybe some new roles that corporates need to think about, particularly for so often we have roles which are the they're product owner roles, there are project management roles, change management roles, but I think you also need someone who is, their role is as a boundary spanner. That person is really connecting, helping these teams connect together, all of the delivery teams, the different types of delivery teams, with the BAU teams that are, we need to, either because there's a change impact or there's an input we need from a subject matter expertise. Then you've got, teams of executives that need to align and for resources to coordinate across those. And you have to make sure that change and project is occurring together. And I think that, in some ways I played that role many times in my career, and there wasn't a name for it, but it's that boundary spanner role where I'm literally getting people into a room and saying, we have to collaborate on this, whether you think it's important or not to your particular part of the project right now. And I know what that does is unearth those unknown unknowns. And there's a process by which you're always looking into your assumptions and being more curious about the things you don't know, how this is going to impact other parts of the business. And I think that as we get sort of in some ways leaner, in corporates, as costs become an issue more and more, and rightly so, we want to be efficient and productive in organizations, but I think sometimes those roles that actually sort of almost straddle across teams is really important.
I completely agree. And to me, that's the fundamental difference, going back to that volume of relationships you're having to manage. If you're at a lean startup, everyone in the organization could sit around a table and talk this stuff through. So everybody knows what everybody else is doing. In a chunky corporate, things fall through the cracks because everybody thinks it's somebody else's job.
Yes.
And change management often, I think, falls in that category. So, I think having those defined roles, and this is something I see is so common with the people that I mentor as well, as an ongoing issue of, if you want something done, give it to a busy person. And so I talk to a number of people and mentor a number of people in organizations who get frustrated, like, well, everything just seems to flow to me.
Yeah.
And it's because where things are undefined, give it to somebody that just gets stuff done. And so to your point, laying out those undefined things, we're going to rebuild new software, but somebody has to make sure that the team that's going to adopt that software, because a lot of software that's built these days is for internal use. Somebody's got to make sure that the team that's going to adopt that software wants it, knows how to use it, is ready to change, because they're going to have to adapt with minimal impact on the business. And so there's layers and layers. And the best program managers I've worked with, to your point, have that curiosity and deep skills. I've seen, to me, there's a spectrum of program management, and you have kind of classic project managers who are just taking the information and reporting the information. And that's useful, but that's not going to drive change. On the other end of the spectrum, I've worked with some fantastic program managers who are so curious that they will not rest until they are confident every angle is covered and they truly understand how it all fits together.
Yes.
Because the difference with the lean startup is you're building everything in your whole ecosystem. You can get your arms around it. In a chunky corporate, your ecosystem is puzzle pieces. And
That's right.
so the bit is the fitting it together. That's where you've got to focus. People are very good at building their pieces, but organizations struggle with fitting them together into a puzzle that makes a pretty picture.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. Just last question. If I'm a CEO and I'm about to launch, launch a project which is a large scale, technology change, maybe it's a replatforming project. I mean, we've talked about a few pitfalls to make sure. What's the key to to my success? What should I be thinking about from the very start?
The first thing is to understand and make sure everyone in the organization understands what are you truly trying to achieve at a high level. So there needs to be a vision. So often I go into these projects where the vision element is overlooked because the business leaders think, well, it's obvious, we're rebuilding software. That could be done a lot of different ways. So lay out the vision and make sure everyone across the organization is aligned to that vision. Because inevitably, when you say we're going to replatform, we're going to rebuild software, your sales team thinks, I'm going to get all these amazing new features.
Yes.
Just all the stuff my customers have been asking for, it's going to be delivered. And, and the engineering team is thinking, we're going to do the exact same thing, just on modern infrastructure. And your operations team is thinking, oh, I'm going to get this much better improved thing. And clients are thinking, oh, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get that. This needs to be defined, and everyone needs to understand what we're trying to achieve. Are we truly just swapping out the infrastructure and giving you a more modern product? Are we going to innovate in how we deliver, how we solve the customer's problem? Because there's lots of room for innovation in a chunky corporate, but it's in the how, not the what. How can we solve this customer's problem in a way that feels comfortable for them, that they will adopt, but is better and more efficient? So for me, that vision needs to be defined, and everyone in the organization needs to be aligned to it and trained to it. And there's a chapter in the book called Chief Poo-Poo Officer, because I got a reputation in my organization. My colleague Chris gets credit for that name. And he started calling me Chief Poo-Poo Officer because everything the sales team asked for, I said, no, we're not going to do that. No, we don't have time. No. So I used to poo-poo everything. But what I was doing was laying out a road where we could actually deliver what we had to deliver, which was working software that does what our customers expect us to do every day. And so all new ideas got poo-pooed until we delivered that. And I was just dying to keep the team focused. And so I think that's really important. We want people to be creative and we want them to be imaginative, but in a replatforming exercise, you've got to channel that into delivering what your customers want, not getting sidetracked by shiny new things.
Exactly. That's right. And I've seen
it sounds boring
too. And then roadmaps become so big and so overwhelming that the execution falters. Yeah. Because you
and
just try to
it sounds really boring.
Change.
That's the thing. For product managers, they want to go build new features. That's the exciting bit. But what we need to remember, go back to what the chunky corporate is. It's a safe haven. It's a stable place. It's not boring. It's secure. It's defined. You can align a large number of people around things that are defined, and that's okay.
Absolutely.
And that's a good thing. Yeah. That's what most people are striving for. That's what most people want. They want to know where they stand. They want to know what comes next, and they want to feel secure and stable in their role and the boundaries of that role. And if we define these things effectively through a strong vision and strong definition of roles, then we can be as lean and efficient as is possible for our organization.
Absolutely. And Katie, just, I feel like I need to maybe just also end with a bit of an advocacy for your chunky corporates. And I know you love chunky corporates too, and you're talking about, you're advocating for them too. But I agree. I think that also they are places because the market reach is so huge often, and you can really make an impact by making a very small change in chunky corporates. Often you're dealing with a lot of either a big internal team or, there's a reach of, millions of customers. And so you can think about that impact amplified. Whereas I think in the startup world, obviously there is the goal is, many founders start with a goal of making an impact, but they start with smaller impacts for smaller amounts of people. And so I think that's the difference too. So while there is maybe that it's not innovation on steroids, but the small things you're doing is actually making a big difference to that customer base who are already perhaps loyal and are sticky, and you're creating more stickiness. And there's a beauty in that too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's not underestimate the value of delivering these products for your existing customers. They rely on you every day. And that's really important, and that's keeping your existing customer base happy is really important.
Exactly. And then of course you've got the other, context where you've got government agencies, government departments, government entities, and they are making life better for their constituents. So, there's even more of a kind of a why there. So Katie,
absolutely.
was there anything perhaps a question I didn't ask you just before we close the conversation?
Well, I think the only other thing I would mention is that, why do we care about this? Why do we want to approach it differently? And, I mentioned this maturity curve that organizations, you start as a lean startup and then you get these resources, you get investments, you start to add people to your organization, and then your business changes. What I didn't mention that I probably should is why is it important that we notice these changes and these inflection points? And the reason for that is what I've observed in a lot of organizations, particularly investment, private investments, organizations that are either funded by private equity or funded by other similar kind of risk intolerant sources, is that it starts to change the values of the business. And when the values of the business change from innovation to execution and regular reporting and all of that, quite often what happens is you get that change in one layer of the organization, but you still have other layers of the organization that are trying to do the lean agile thing, and they're spending a lot of capital that's not aligned to how the top leadership has changed their perspective. So you get this performance plateau. And so why do we care? Like, why do you care if there's a mismatch? Why do you care if there's misalignment? Because it often leads to a performance plateau. And it's not until profitability starts to falter and boardrooms start to kick around the word cost that people really start to grapple with this. And it usually starts with, why are we spending $20 million a year on tech? All right. And if that conversation's happening in the boardroom, you're behind the curve. And that can lead to a very painful period for your product and technology organization. So the only other thing I would say is the whole reason for trying to get ahead of this and try to tackle it differently is to avoid that reactive approach to changing the way we do product and technology in these large organizations. You want to get ahead of it before you hit a performance plateau. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's very wise. Thank you so much, Katie. I appreciate your time. And thank you so much for being on the podcast. It was so lovely to talk about large scale change and thinking about that journey from startup all the way to chunky corporates. And I love the word chunky corporates. I'm going to use that. Is that okay?
Of course, please.
I'll adopt that one.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure.